You already know what to do. The problem is, you don't do it. There comes a moment when you stop trusting your own promises. You tell yourself you'll change. You say you'll push harder. You believe this time will be different. But when the moment arrives, something pulls you back. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to keep you exactly where you are. And at first, you don't even notice it. It feels like hesitation, like waiting for the right mood, the right energy, the right time. But if you're honest, that moment never comes. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, and the version of you that was supposed to emerge never does. Not because you don't want it, not because you lack potential, but because your mind has been trained quietly, repeatedly to respond the same way when things get difficult. To slow down, to question, to retreat just enough to stay comfortable. And that pattern is stronger than motivation, stronger than excitement, stronger than that temporary surge you feel after hearing something powerful. Because motivation fades, conditioning stays. And conditioning controls what you do when the feeling disappears. So the real question isn't how to feel more inspired. The real question is, what do you do when you don't feel inspired at all? Because that is the moment that defines everything. The moment where most people stop and a few keep going. There is a way to take control of that moment. Not by forcing yourself with willpower, but by changing what runs through your mind before you act. Because your thoughts are not neutral. They are instructions. And when repeated enough, they begin to replace hesitation with certainty. Repetition is not just habit. It is force. Whatever you expose your mind to again and again begins to feel normal, then familiar, then true. And once something feels true, your actions start aligning with it automatically. Right now, most people are repeating the wrong things. Quiet doubts, subtle fears, limiting beliefs that sound reasonable but hold them back. They don't even realize they are reinforcing these patterns every single day. But imagine reversing that. Imagine feeding your mind words that demand action, words that eliminate excuses, words that push you forward even when everything inside you wants to stop. Not words that comfort you, but words that challenge you. At first, it will feel unnatural, uncomfortable, even wrong. Your mind will resist it, question it, try to reject it, because you are interrupting a pattern that has been running for years, and anything that disrupts a pattern will feel wrong in the beginning. But if you stay with it, something begins to change. Slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed. The hesitation starts to fade. The internal resistance weakens, and you begin to act faster before doubt has time to take control. This is where transformation actually begins. Not in big dramatic moments, but in small, repeated decisions where you choose to move instead of pause, to act instead of overthink, to push instead of retreat. And the more you repeat it, the stronger it becomes. The more you repeat it, the stronger it becomes. Your mind begins to expect action. It no longer defaults to hesitation. It no longer searches for excuses. Instead, it moves automatically, naturally, without the same internal resistance that once held you back. And when that shift begins, something changes in the way you experience your life. Discipline no longer feels forced. It no longer feels like something you have to fight for every single day. It becomes part of how you operate. You start to notice it in everything, the way you approach your work, the way you respond under pressure, the way you react when things don't go your way. Instead of breaking, you adjust. Instead of stopping, you continue. And in that continuation, something deeper begins to form. Not excitement, not motivation, but certainty. A quiet, steady confidence that does not depend on how you feel in the moment. A sense that no matter what happens, you will keep moving forward. That is what makes a person unstoppable. Not perfection, not constant energy, not always feeling ready, but the ability to act especially when it's uncomfortable, inconvenient, or difficult. But everything comes back to one central point. What you allow your mind to hear again and again. Because those repeated thoughts do not stay as thoughts. They become beliefs. And those beliefs shape how you see yourself. And how you see yourself determines how you act, especially in the moments that matter most. That is why what you are about to repeat to yourself is not meant to be heard once and forgotten. It is meant to be repeated, absorbed, driven into your thinking until it becomes automatic, until it replaces the patterns that have been holding you back for so long. Repeat it when you feel tired. Repeat it when doubt begins to appear. Repeat it when you feel like stopping, especially then. Because those are the moments when your old patterns are strongest, and those are the moments where change matters most. If you stay with this long enough, something begins to harden inside you, not in a negative way, but in a powerful one. A resilience, a refusal to break, a mindset that does not collapse under pressure, but pushes through it. And once that begins to take shape, everything starts to shift. You stop waiting. You stop hesitating. You stop negotiating with yourself. You simply move. And in that movement, you begin to build a version of yourself that is no longer easily stopped. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become stronger. And when that shift is complete, you will no longer depend on motivation. You will have something far more powerful. You will have control. There comes a point in a man's life when he begins to recognize something he has ignored for far too long. Not because it was hidden, but because it was subtle. It does not show up as failure. It does not arrive with noise. It reveals itself quietly in the moments where action was intended but never taken. If you were to begin again, you would not first look at what you failed to do. You would look at what you repeatedly allowed to happen. Because a man does not lose control all at once. He gives it up gradually, through small moments where he chooses not to follow through on what he already decided. There is a pattern in these moments. You decide to act. You tell yourself you will move, that you will change, that this time will be different. And in that moment, you believe it. But when the time comes to act, something intervenes, not forcefully, not dramatically, but quietly. A pause, a delay, a slight step back. And if you were paying attention, you would realize this is not random. It is conditioned. It has been repeated so many times that it now feels natural. There is a misunderstanding here that must be corrected. You may think you lack discipline. You may think you lack strength or drive. But in most cases, that is not true. What you lack is alignment. Alignment between what you decide and what you do. Because desire without action weakens over time, and what weakens eventually disappears. There is also something more damaging happening beneath the surface. Each time you say you will act and you don't, you break trust with yourself. Not outwardly, but internally. You teach yourself that your word does not matter, that your decisions are temporary, that your intentions can be ignored. And this teaching does not happen once, it happens repeatedly. And what is repeated becomes belief. If you were to begin again, you would protect this internal trust above everything else, because without it, no real progress can be sustained. There is also the speed of this pattern. It happens quickly. The moment appears. The decision has already been made. But before action is taken, thought steps in. It suggests delay. It offers justification. It presents comfort as something reasonable. And because this thought is familiar, you accept it. If you were to begin again, you would interrupt this process early, not by thinking more, but by acting sooner. There are many people living inside this pattern without ever realizing it. They talk about what they will do, they plan, they intend, but their actions do not follow consistently. And over time, they begin to see themselves as inconsistent people, not because they are incapable, but because they have practiced inconsistency. If you were to begin again, you would refuse to accept that identity. You would replace it through action. There is a clear difference between someone who follows through and someone who doesn't. The first does not speak excessively about what they will do. They act. And through action, they build something powerful. A reputation not just with others, but with themselves. The second speaks often but acts less. And because of that, they appear uncertain. Not because they lack ideas, but because their actions do not support them. If you were to begin again, you would become the first person, not through force, but through repetition. There are examples of this principle everywhere. People who built something meaningful did not rely on intention alone. They acted repeatedly, consistently, and through that repetition, they built something more valuable than results. They built self-trust, and self-trust creates confidence that cannot be shaken easily. Not because you feel strong, but because you have proof. There is also a compounding effect to all of this. One small delay may seem insignificant, but repeated delays create a pattern, and that pattern shapes identity. Over time, you become what you repeatedly do. So if you were to begin again, you would treat every small moment as important. Not because it is big, but because it is repeated. And what is repeated becomes who you are. But the reverse is also true. A man decides and acts, then he does it again and again. At first, it requires effort. He must overcome hesitation. He must interrupt old habits. But with repetition, something begins to change. Action becomes easier. Hesitation weakens, and eventually the pause disappears. If you were to begin again, you would continue until that transformation is complete, because something powerful begins to rebuild inside you. Trust. Each time you follow through, you strengthen your belief in yourself. You begin to expect action. You no longer question whether you will move. You know you will. And in that knowing, confidence is formed. Not loud confidence, not arrogance, but certainty. There is also how others begin to see you. A person who acts consistently is perceived differently. Reliable, focused, capable. People trust their word because it is backed by action, and as a result, opportunities begin to appear. Not because you chase them, but because your behavior attracted them. But that is not the goal. The goal is control. Because when what you say and what you do are aligned, you gain something most people never develop. Consistency. And consistency leads to momentum. And momentum leads to results. So if this were to be reduced to a simple instruction, it would be this. Do what you decide, immediately, without delay. Let that become fixed in your mind. I follow through. I act when I decide. I do not retreat. Repeat this not as motivation, but as command. Because when the mind is trained to act on decision, hesitation begins to disappear. And when hesitation disappears, action becomes continuous. And when action becomes continuous, you are no longer someone who intends. You become someone who executes, consistently, relentlessly, without returning to the pattern that once kept you stuck. Once you begin to understand that broken promises are not failure, but a repeated pattern, you start to see what truly governs your actions. Not your intentions, not your motivation, but your conditioning. Because most people act with certainty when they feel strong, when energy is high, when the mind is clear. In those moments, action feels natural, progress feels easy. But that state never lasts. And when it fades, something else takes over. Conditioning. If you were to begin again, you would stop relying on how you feel. You would begin examining what you have trained yourself to do when you don't feel like acting. Because that moment when motivation disappears is the moment that defines everything. There is a misunderstanding that must be corrected. You may believe you need more motivation, more inspiration, more drive. But motivation is temporary. It rises, it falls, it disappears. And when it disappears, you don't rise to your goals. You fall back to your conditioning. So if you were to begin again, you would not chase stronger emotions. You would build stronger patterns, because patterns remain when feelings fade. There is a moment that appears whenever effort becomes difficult. The mind begins to speak. It suggests pause. It suggests delay. It offers reasons that sound logical, reasonable, even necessary. And because you have accepted these thoughts before you accept them again, not consciously, automatically, this is not weakness. This is training. If you were to begin again, you would recognize this moment immediately, because this is where your conditioning reveals itself. Not when things are easy, but when resistance appears. Many people can act when it feels good. They begin with excitement. They move with energy. But the moment difficulty shows up, they slow down, they hesitate, they retreat, and without realizing it, they reinforce the exact pattern they are trying to escape. If you were to begin again, you would measure yourself differently, not by how you act when you feel strong, but by how you act when you feel nothing, because that is where control is built. There is also the way this conditioning is formed, a delay here, a hesitation there, a moment of retreat, repeated again and again. And each time it becomes easier, more natural, more expected, until eventually it no longer feels like a decision. It feels like your nature. If you were to begin again, you would interrupt this process early, because what is repeated becomes automatic, and what becomes automatic controls your behavior without question. But there is another version of you, a different response, a different pattern, a version that acts even when it does not feel ready, a version that moves when resistance appears, a version that continues when effort becomes uncomfortable. This version does not exist because life is easier. It exists because the response is different. If you were to begin again, you would become this version, not by waiting to feel strong, but by acting before strength appears. There are examples of this everywhere. People who achieved something meaningful did not rely on moments of inspiration alone. They continued when things became uncertain. They moved when problems appeared. They acted when effort was required beyond comfort. Their actions were not controlled by emotion. They were guided by decision. If you were to begin again, you would follow this same principle. There is also something important that happens over time. Conditioning begins to replace decision. At first, you must decide every time. You must push yourself. You must remind yourself. But with repetition, something shifts. You no longer need to decide. You no longer ask yourself whether you will act. You simply act because it has become part of who you are. That is when discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. There is also a danger you must understand. Temporary motivation. You hear something powerful. You feel energized. You take action for a while. But if that action is not repeated beyond the feeling, it fades, and you return to your old pattern. If you were to begin again, you would not depend on these moments. You would use them, but you would build beyond them. Because real change does not happen in moments. It happens in repetition. There is also the process of reversing the pattern. You must act when you don't feel like it. You must continue when resistance appears. And you must repeat this again and again until resistance weakens. Because resistance is not permanent. It is sustained through repetition. If you stop reinforcing it, it fades. At first, this will require effort. You will need to push. You will need to act against what feels natural. But over time, something changes. The effort decreases. The hesitation fades. The action becomes faster, more immediate, more natural. If you were to begin again, you would continue until you reach this stage, because this is where transformation becomes stable. There is also how others begin to see you. A person who acts consistently, regardless of condition, appears different, stable, reliable, certain. They do not see your internal struggle. They see your consistency, and that consistency creates trust, respect, opportunity. But again, that is not the goal. The goal is internal control, because when you can act without depending on how you feel, you become dangerous in the best way. You become someone who cannot be easily stopped. There is also a compounding effect. Each time you act when you don't feel like it, you strengthen the new pattern. Each time you continue, you weaken the old one. And over time, the new pattern becomes dominant. If you were to begin again, you would trust this process, because it is gradual but certain. There is also a different kind of confidence that begins to form, not based on excitement, not based on belief alone, but based on proof. You know you will act because you have done it repeatedly. You no longer depend on motivation. You depend on your conditioning, and that is far more powerful, because motivation is unstable. Conditioning is reliable. And once your conditioning is built, you no longer need to fight yourself. You move automatically, consistently, without hesitation. And that is where everything begins to change. You stop waiting. You stop overthinking. You stop negotiating. You simply act. And in that action, you build momentum. And in that momentum, you build identity. A version of yourself that does not collapse under pressure. That does not retreat when things become difficult. That continues regardless of how it feels. That is what it means to become unstoppable. Not perfect. Not always motivated, but always moving forward. And it all comes back to one thing. What you repeat to yourself. Because those repeated thoughts become your instructions. Those instructions become your actions. And those actions become your life. So choose them carefully. Repeat them deliberately. And build them until they become automatic. Because once they do, you will no longer need to force yourself. You will no longer need to rely on motivation. You will no longer need to fight hesitation. You will have already replaced it with something stronger, with something stable, with something that cannot be easily broken. You will have built control,